There was a time when shopping wasn't about convenience or discounts. It was about status, about being seen. That time was the Gilded Age, an era of enormous fortunes, bold ambition, and people eager to show exactly how wealthy they were. And one of the most public places to display that wealth was in the shops themselves. These weren't stores as we think of them today. They were grand, carefully designed spaces meant to impress. Marble floors replaced wooden planks. Chandeliers glowed over imported goods. Sales staff were trained not just to help, but to flatter. Shopping became an experience, and for the elite, a kind of ritual. In this video, we're stepping inside the most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age. And before we begin, if you enjoy uncovering forgotten worlds of wealth, culture, and history, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this. Also, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from today? In New York, Bloomingdale's rose from a modest specialty store into a sprawling department store that catered to elite tastes. Its expansion mirrored the ambitions of the city itself, offering fashion, accessories, and luxury goods under one roof, all presented with theatrical flair. Chicago answered with Marshall Field's, a store that rewrote the rules of retail. Fixed prices replaced haggling. Window displays became spectacles. The phrase, "the customer is always right," was not marketing, it was doctrine. Shopping there was as much about being seen as it was about buying. On Fifth Avenue, Henri Bendel became synonymous with refinement. Its signature brown and white stripes signaled exclusivity. Inside, Parisian fashion and carefully curated luxury told customers they belonged to a higher world. Across the Atlantic, Harrods dominated London's Knightsbridge. What began as a grocer evolved into a global symbol of wealth. Its escalators, Egyptian hall, and endless departments turned shopping into an international attraction. Nearby, Harvey Nichols catered to those who wanted luxury without spectacle. Its silks, laces, and later ready-to-wear fashions appealed to a discerning clientele who valued taste over excess. In Paris, the House of Worth defined couture itself. Charles Frederick Worth did not simply sell dresses, he sold identity. Royalty and American heiresses traveled across oceans to be dressed in his creations, garments that announced power and prestige. San Francisco had City of Paris, a store that brought European elegance to the American West. Its stained glass rotunda stood as proof that refinement could thrive even at the edge of the continent. A.T. Stewart in New York built the blueprint for the modern department store. His marble and iron palaces offered everything imaginable, setting standards that competitors would chase for decades. Siegel Cooper took ambition even further, creating an indoor city of commerce. Restaurants, banks, medical offices, and fashion coexisted under one roof, redefining what a store could be. Surrounding many of these establishments was Ladies' Mile, a district designed for affluent women to shop freely and safely. It marked a cultural shift, turning shopping into a socially acceptable public activity for women of means. Together, these shops reshaped cities, influenced architecture, and changed social behavior. They were not just places to buy goods. They were stages where wealth was displayed and status was negotiated. By the early 20th century, economic shifts, changing tastes, and new retail models brought many of these institutions to an end. But their influence remains. Every luxury flagship, every experiential store traces its lineage back to the Gilded Age. These were the most luxurious shops of their time, and they didn't just sell products, they sold dreams. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of Gilded Age luxury, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey into history's most extravagant eras. As these grand shops multiplied, they began to influence not only how people spent money, but how cities were designed. Entire neighborhoods reorganized themselves around luxury retail. Streets were widened, transit routes were adjusted, storefronts grew taller, brighter, and more ornate, competing for attention in an urban theater of wealth. Architecture became a language of persuasion. Cast iron facades allowed for massive display windows. Glass domes and skylights flooded interiors with light, turning merchandise into spectacle. Elevators and escalators were novelties, symbols of progress as much as convenience. To shop in these places was to step inside the future. Inside, everything was choreographed. Departments were carefully arranged to guide movement. High-margin luxury goods occupied prime spaces. Seating areas encouraged lingering. Tea rooms and restaurants ensured customers stayed for hours, not minutes. Time spent inside often translated into money spent. Sales staff were trained in etiquette and discretion. They remembered names, preferences, and social rank. For elite customers, shopping became deeply personal. Purchases were wrapped not just in paper, but in reassurance of belonging. These stores also played a quiet role in shaping gender dynamics. For wealthy women, department stores offered rare independence. They became socially acceptable public spaces where women could move freely, manage money, and exert consumer power without male supervision. At the same time, these palaces of luxury relied on vast unseen labor forces. Clerks, seamstresses, stock boys, cleaners, and delivery drivers worked long hours behind the scenes. The glittering surfaces masked rigid hierarchies and demanding conditions that mirrored the inequalities of the era itself. International influence flowed through these shops. Paris set fashion standards. London defined decorum. American stores absorbed these signals and amplified them, creating a transatlantic luxury culture that elite families recognized instantly. Seasonal events became major attractions. Holiday window displays drew crowds. New fashion arrivals were treated like cultural moments. Shopping calendars began to shape social calendars, reinforcing the idea that consumption itself was entertainment. Yet, even at their height, these institutions were fragile. They depended on fortunes that could vanish, on tastes that could shift, and on cities that were constantly changing. Fires, economic downturns, and new competitors began to test their dominance. By the early 20th century, mass production and changing social values eroded the exclusivity that once defined them. What had been rare became accessible. What had been elite became aspirational for the middle class. Some stores adapted, others vanished. Buildings were demolished, repurposed, or stripped of their former grandeur. Names that once symbolized excess faded into footnotes. Still, the blueprint remained. Modern luxury retail borrows heavily from these pioneers. Flagship stores, brand storytelling, curated experiences, and architectural drama all trace back to the Gilded Age. The idea that shopping could be immersive, emotional, and status-defining was born here. In marble halls and beneath glowing chandeliers, commerce became culture. And long after the doors closed, the legacy of these luxurious shops continued to shape how the world shops, desires, and defines luxury itself. As the 20th century advanced, the world these shops had been built for began to disappear. Old fortunes fractured through inheritance. New wealth emerged from different industries, less interested in ritual and display, more focused on speed and convenience. The slow, ceremonial act of shopping no longer suited a changing society. Urban landscapes evolved. Land once occupied by sprawling department stores became more valuable than the businesses themselves. Fifth Avenue, State Street, and Knightsbridge transformed into commercial corridors where retail space was measured in profit per square foot, not grandeur. Many Gilded Age stores could not justify their scale. Technological change also played its part. Electricity replaced gaslight. Factories standardized production. Ready-to-wear clothing reduced the need for couture-level craftsmanship. Luxury became reproducible, and exclusivity harder to protect. World events accelerated the decline. World War I disrupted European fashion houses and international trade. The Great Depression shattered discretionary spending. Even the wealthiest families tightened their budgets, and luxury retail suffered accordingly. Some institutions attempted reinvention. Departments were modernized, interiors simplified, branding shifted toward broader audiences. In doing so, many lost the mystique that once set them apart. The palace became a store. The experience became transactional. Others simply closed. Their buildings were sold, demolished, or repurposed. Marble halls became office space. Skylights were covered. Decorative ironwork was removed. What had once symbolized aspiration became inconvenient relics of excess. Yet nostalgia followed quickly. As these spaces vanished, they were romanticized. Photographs, postcards, and memories preserved an image of elegance that reality had long since eroded. The Gilded Age shop became shorthand for lost grandeur. In the late 20th century, luxury retail began borrowing from its own past. Flagship stores reintroduced drama. Brands invested in architecture again. Shopping became experiential once more, echoing strategies perfected over a century earlier. Modern luxury stores may look different, but their philosophy remains familiar. They sell identity, not objects. They promise belonging, not utility. They stage desire within carefully designed environments. The difference is scale. Where Gilded Age shops catered to a narrow elite, modern luxury addresses a global audience. Exclusivity is curated through branding rather than access. The palace is no longer physical alone. It exists digitally, socially, symbolically. Still, the foundations remain unmistakable. Window displays that stop pedestrians mid-stride. Interiors designed to slow movement. Staff trained in subtle persuasion. These are inherited techniques. The Gilded Age proved that consumption could be emotional, theatrical, and social. It taught retailers how to shape desire and taught customers how to perform status. Though the chandeliers have dimmed and the names have faded, the influence of these luxurious shops remains embedded in modern culture. They were not just stores. They were mirrors of ambition, inequality, innovation, and desire. And in understanding them, we understand not only how people shopped, but how they wanted to be seen. At their core, these luxurious shops reflected the contradictions of the Gilded Age itself. Immense beauty existed alongside deep inequality. While elite shoppers strolled beneath stained glass and chandeliers, millions of workers labored in factories that made such consumption possible. The department store became both a symbol of progress and a reminder of imbalance. These retail palaces also functioned as cultural arbiters. They decided what was fashionable, respectable, and desirable. Trends were not discovered organically. They were introduced, curated, and endorsed within these spaces. To buy from the right store was to align oneself with modernity and taste. Advertising expanded alongside them. Illustrated catalogs, newspaper spreads, and lavish signage reinforced the authority of these shops. Even those who never entered their doors were influenced by their imagery. Luxury became aspirational long before it became accessible. International travel strengthened their power. Wealthy Americans returned from Europe with expectations shaped by Paris and London. Stores that could replicate continental elegance gained credibility. Those that could not were left behind. The physical act of shopping also changed behavior. Escalators and elevators encouraged vertical exploration. Seating areas normalized lingering. Restrooms, once rare in public spaces, made extended visits comfortable. These innovations quietly redefined how people used cities. For many women, These shops offered professional opportunity as well as freedom. Sales positions, buyers, decorators, and managers emerged as respectable careers. Though limited by class and race, department stores became early workplaces for women outside the home. By the time the Gilded Age faded, the blueprint for modern consumer culture was complete. Retail was no longer about supply meeting demand. It was about experience shaping desire. What replaced these palaces was more efficient, more accessible, and less ceremonial. But something was lost in the transition: the sense of occasion, the drama, the idea that shopping itself could feel monumental. Today, when luxury brands invest millions into flagship stores, immersive interiors, and storytelling, they are reviving a philosophy born more than a century ago. They are echoing Bloomingdale's, Marshall Field's, Harrods, and Worth, whether consciously or not. These shops taught the world how to sell fantasy. They proved that environment matters, that presentation creates value, that people do not simply buy things, they buy meaning. The Gilded Age may have ended, but its most luxurious shops left behind more than buildings and brand names. They left a permanent imprint on how wealth is displayed, how status is performed, and how desire is cultivated. And that legacy continues every time a door opens onto polished floors, soft lighting, and the promise of something just out of reach. By the final years of the Gilded Age, the grand experiment of luxury retail had permanently altered public expectations. Customers no longer viewed stores as neutral spaces. They expected beauty, service, and emotional engagement. Anything less felt inadequate. This shift created pressure across the retail world. Smaller merchants struggled to compete with spectacle. Independent shops either aligned themselves with luxury ideals or repositioned toward affordability and speed. The middle ground slowly disappeared. Department stores became landmarks. People gave directions using them. Street life organized around them. Meeting under the clock or by the rotunda became part of urban culture. These buildings were not just commercial centers, but social anchors. Their interiors also shaped memory. Shoppers remembered how a place felt more than what they purchased: the echo of footsteps on marble floors, the scent of leather and perfume, the hushed confidence of well-trained staff. These sensory details created loyalty long before branding language existed. Luxury retail also normalized excess. Owning more than one needed became aspirational rather than shameful. Consumption turned into proof of success. The act of buying became self-validation, a pattern that would intensify in the decades to come. As mass culture expanded, imitation followed. Middle-class stores adopted visual cues from elite retailers. Display windows, seasonal themes, and curated collections filtered downward. Luxury dictated the rules, even for those who could not afford it. When many of these Gilded Age institutions disappeared, cities mourned them quietly. Their loss marked more than economic change. It marked the end of an era when public spaces were designed to astonish rather than optimize. Yet fragments remain. Facades preserved, rotundas repurposed, names remembered in history books and whispered in fashion lore. These remnants hint at a time when commerce dared to be unapologetically grand. In studying these shops, we see more than retail history. We see how power expresses itself through space, how wealth seeks visibility, how culture forms around objects and environments. The luxurious shops of the Gilded Age were never just about selling goods. They were about shaping identity, reinforcing hierarchy, and staging aspiration. Their doors may be closed, but their influence is still open for business. In the end, the most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age were reflections of a society intoxicated by possibility. Industrial wealth had arrived faster than social restraint. Money sought form, and retail provided a visible, acceptable outlet for display. These stores taught the elite how to consume publicly. They provided scripts for behavior, from how long one lingered at a counter to how purchases were presented and carried. Shopping became performance, and every detail mattered. They also reshaped class boundaries. While entry was technically open to all, true participation required wealth, knowledge, and confidence. The doors were unlocked, but belonging was selective. Luxury was less about access and more about recognition. Over time, this model proved both powerful and unstable. When economic conditions shifted, the illusion collapsed quickly. Grandeur could not shield these institutions from bankruptcy, redevelopment, or changing values. Yet their disappearance did not erase their lessons. Modern branding, experiential marketing, and flagship retail all owe a debt to the Gilded Age. The idea that a space can tell a story, elevate a product, and define a customer identity was perfected here. Today's luxury consumer may shop online or travel globally, but the emotional mechanics remain the same. Desire is still carefully staged, status is still subtly communicated, environment still shapes perception. Looking back, these shops reveal more than opulence. They expose how societies express ambition, insecurity, and power through consumption. They show how architecture, commerce, and culture intertwine. The Gilded Age ended, but its retail vision never truly vanished. It simply evolved. And every time luxury invites us to step inside, slow down, and admire, we are walking through doors first opened more than a century ago. What remains today is not just history, but influence. The luxurious shops of the Gilded Age established a global language of prestige that still governs how luxury is presented and perceived. They proved that where something is sold matters just as much as what is being sold. These stores understood human psychology long before it was studied formally. They recognized that desire is shaped by environment, by ritual, by the feeling of exclusivity. They built spaces that slowed time, heightened emotion, and transformed ordinary objects into symbols of success. Even now, echoes of these palaces appear everywhere. In flagship boutiques designed by celebrity architects, in private shopping salons, in carefully staged window displays meant to stop passers-by in their tracks. The blueprint has endured. The Gilded Age shops also remind us that luxury is never permanent. Fortunes rise and fall. Tastes shift. What once defined refinement can quickly become excess. Yet each generation finds new ways to recreate the same illusion under different names. To study these stores is to study aspiration itself. They show how societies reward wealth, how status is performed, and how consumption becomes culture. They reveal that luxury is less about possession and more about perception. Though many of their doors are closed, their legacy continues to shape modern cities, modern brands, and modern desires. The chandeliers may be gone, but the glow remains. These were the most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age, not just places of commerce, but monuments to ambition. If you enjoyed this exploration of history's most extravagant retail empires, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next journey into the world of wealth, power, and forgotten grandeur. Long after the last purchases were made and the final doors were locked, these shops continued to live on in collective memory. They became reference points for what luxury once meant, benchmarks against which all future excess would be measured. Historians, architects, and designers still study their layouts and materials. The way light was used to flatter fabrics, the deliberate placement of mirrors to create abundance, the subtle choreography that guided customers without them ever noticing. Nothing was accidental. Even their failures became lessons. Overexpansion, rigid business models, and dependence on a narrow elite revealed the risks of tying identity too tightly to wealth. When society changed, those unable to adapt disappeared. Yet, adaptation itself often meant dilution. To survive, some stores sacrificed exclusivity for volume. Others lost craftsmanship in pursuit of efficiency. In doing so, they survived in name but not in spirit. The Gilded Age shops remind us that luxury thrives on tension, between access and restriction, between beauty and inequality, between permanence and fragility. Remove that tension, and the magic fades. Today's luxury brands attempt to recreate that balance in new ways. Limited editions, private appointments, invitation-only experiences. These are modern answers to old questions first posed in marble halls and under-stained glass. What these historic shops ultimately reveal is that luxury is a story people choose to believe, a shared agreement between seller and buyer, a performance sustained by space, symbolism, and desire. Once the story no longer convinced, the palace emptied. But when it worked completely. For a brief, glittering moment in history, shopping was not just about buying something new. It was about stepping into a world that promised elevation, importance, and belonging. That promise, fragile, intoxicating, and endlessly repeatable, was the true product of the most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age. And that promise did not end with the closing of their doors. It migrated. It reshaped itself to fit new centuries, new technologies, and new audiences. The spirit of Gilded Age luxury retail survived by changing form rather than disappearing. As cities modernized, the idea of the grand department store fractured into specialized luxury boutiques. Instead of one palace selling everything, individual brands began creating their own controlled worlds. Each storefront became a miniature version of the old retail temples, carefully designed to communicate heritage, power, and exclusivity. The emphasis on storytelling intensified. Just as House of Worth sold gowns wrapped in prestige, modern luxury brands sell narratives, craftsmanship, lineage, scarcity. These ideas are descendants of the same cultural logic that once drew crowds beneath glass domes and mosaic ceilings. Tourism also inherited this legacy. Luxury shopping districts became destinations in their own right. Fifth Avenue, Bond Street, the Champs-Élysées, and Via Monte Napoleone function not only as retail corridors, but as symbols of global wealth. Walking them is an experience, even without making a purchase. Museums and preservation societies later recognized what had been lost. Former department stores were reclassified as architectural treasures. Rotundas, staircases, and facades were saved not for commerce, but for memory. They became reminders of a time when retail dared to be monumental. Culturally, the Gilded Age shop left behind a paradox. It democratized access to beauty while reinforcing hierarchy. Anyone could enter, but not everyone could belong. That contradiction still defines luxury today. In many ways, modern consumer culture remains locked in conversation with this past. We continue to chase the feeling these places created: importance, recognition, elevation. The surroundings change, but the desire does not. The luxurious shops of the Gilded Age were experiments in human longing. They tested how space, design, and ritual could transform money into meaning. And, in doing so, they permanently altered how the world understands luxury. As the story closes, what becomes clear is that these shops were never meant to last forever. They were products of a specific moment, when wealth concentrated rapidly, cities expanded aggressively, and society believed progress should be visible, monumental, and dazzling. The Gilded Age gave luxury a physical form. It taught commerce to think like theater and architecture to serve desire. It trained generations of consumers to associate elegance with space, ritual, and restraint, rather than function alone. When those conditions faded, the buildings followed. But the ideas did not. Today, luxury still depends on what these shops perfected: atmosphere, anticipation, and the feeling of being chosen. Whether inside a historic flagship, a private showroom, or a digital storefront, the mechanics remain strikingly familiar. The most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age were not simply retailers. They were cultural institutions. They shaped taste, reinforced power, and defined what it meant to want more than necessity. Their legacy is not measured in surviving walls or brand names, but in the way luxury continues to operate. And as long as wealth seeks display and desire seeks a stage, the spirit of those gilded palaces will never truly disappear. What endures most powerfully is the lesson these shops left behind about aspiration. They demonstrated that luxury does not rely solely on rarity or price, but on atmosphere and belief. People were not only buying objects, they were buying the feeling of having arrived. These spaces legitimized wealth. They transformed private money into public status. To be seen shopping in the right place mattered as much as what was purchased. Reputation was built in aisles and salons, under chandeliers, and beside grand staircases. The Gilded Age may now exist only in photographs and memory, but its retail vision still frames modern desire. Every time luxury invites us to slow down, admire, and imagine a more elevated version of ourselves, it is repeating a formula perfected over a century ago. These were the most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age, not just monuments to excess, but blueprints for how luxury continues to function today. If you enjoyed this documentary exploration of history's grandest retail empires, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next journey into wealth, power, and forgotten elegance. The most important thing to understand is that luxury retail during the Gilded Age was never accidental. Every detail was engineered to shape perception. From the width of aisles to the height of ceilings, these environments were designed to make customers feel smaller, wealthier, and more significant all at once. Light was carefully controlled. Natural daylight filtered through skylights to soften colors and enhance fabrics. Artificial lighting highlighted displays and guided movement. Shadows were minimized. Nothing was left to chance. Merchandise was staged like art, encouraging admiration before purchase. Sound mattered too. Thick carpets muted footsteps. Heavy doors reduced street noise. Conversation felt private, even in crowded rooms. Shopping became hushed, controlled, and deliberate, reinforcing the sense that one had entered a refined world removed from ordinary life. Time behaved differently inside these spaces. There were no clocks in prominent view. Seating areas invited rest. Tea rooms extended visits. The longer a customer stayed, the more likely desire would deepen. This understanding of psychological pacing was decades ahead of its time. Luxury shops also controlled scarcity. Not everything was displayed. Certain items were shown only on request. Some customers were subtly steered toward exclusive salons or private fittings. Access itself became part of the product. These stores did not simply respond to demand. They created it. Fashion cycles accelerated. Seasonal collections dictated taste. What was acceptable one year became outdated the next. Consumption became continuous, not occasional. This shift altered personal identity. Clothing and objects became extensions of self. To shop correctly was to signal intelligence, refinement, and belonging. Mistakes were visible. The wrong store, the wrong style, the wrong presentation carried social consequences. At the same time, luxury retail normalized inequality. Excess was framed as beauty. Cost became synonymous with quality. The labor behind products was hidden, allowing glamour to exist without discomfort. As modern consumers, we still operate within this framework. Even when shopping online, we respond to imagery, storytelling, and controlled access. The mechanics of desire remain unchanged. The luxurious shops of the Gilded Age were laboratories of consumer psychology. They tested how far environment could shape behavior. The results were permanent. What they ultimately proved is that luxury is less about objects and more about experience, less about ownership and more about emotion. That truth, once discovered, could never be forgotten. And it still defines how the world shops today. By the time the Gilded Age reached its final decades, the influence of these luxurious shops had extended far beyond retail. They had altered how people understood success itself. Wealth was no longer measured only in land or industry, but in visible participation in elite consumer culture. To shop at the right store became a form of social language. It signaled education, travel, and familiarity with unspoken rules. These spaces taught customers how to move, how to speak to staff, even how to carry packages. Every gesture communicated position. The shops also reinforced global hierarchies. European fashion houses dictated taste. American retailers translated those standards for domestic elites. Paris, London, and New York formed a triangle of influence that defined luxury worldwide. What appeared in their windows shaped wardrobes across continents. Behind the scenes, innovation thrived. Inventory systems, supply chains, visual merchandising, and customer service models developed rapidly. Many practices still used in retail today were refined in these environments, born out of the need to manage scale without sacrificing exclusivity. Yet this sophistication depended on contradiction. The same stores that celebrated refinement relied on rigid labor discipline. Long hours, strict appearance standards, and limited mobility defined life for employees. The elegance experienced by customers was sustained through invisible effort. As the 20th century progressed, public attitudes shifted. Excess began to feel uncomfortable. Displays once admired were criticized as wasteful. What had symbolized progress now suggested imbalance. Luxury retail found itself out of step with a changing moral climate. Some institutions responded by simplifying. Others doubled down on heritage. A few embraced nostalgia, marketing themselves as guardians of tradition rather than engines of novelty. Survival required reinvention, but reinvention often meant abandoning the very qualities that once defined them. Still, the cultural memory endured. Writers, filmmakers, and historians returned repeatedly to these spaces as symbols of ambition and fragility. The grand store became shorthand for a world built quickly and lost just as fast. Today, luxury retail exists in constant negotiation with that past. Brands borrow its aesthetics while avoiding its excess. They promise intimacy instead of scale, curation instead of abundance. Yet the underlying goal remains the same: to make desire feel earned. The most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age were experiments in how space could shape human behavior. They demonstrated that consumption could be emotional, social, and symbolic all at once. Their buildings may be gone, but their lessons persist. Every carefully lit boutique, every invitation-only showroom, every curated luxury experience carries forward ideas first tested in those gilded halls. In understanding these shops, we understand not only a moment in history, but the foundations of modern desire itself. As the era closed, the disappearance of many Gilded Age shops revealed how closely they were tied to a specific social structure. These stores depended on concentrated wealth, rigid class distinctions, and a shared belief that luxury should be publicly displayed. When those conditions weakened, the model fractured. Urban change played a decisive role. Cities grew denser. Transportation improved. Shoppers no longer needed to spend entire days in one monumental store. Convenience began to rival ceremony. Smaller, faster retail formats emerged, better suited to modern life. Cultural values also shifted. Younger generations questioned inherited privilege. The idea of excess for its own sake lost moral authority. Luxury did not vanish, but it learned to disguise itself, becoming quieter, more restrained, and more symbolic. Many former retail palaces were stripped of ornament and adapted to new uses. What had once been temples of desire became offices, warehouses, universities, or government buildings. Their original purpose faded, but their scale and craftsmanship remained as silent witnesses. Preservation efforts saved fragments, a rotunda here, a facade there. These remnants allow us to glimpse a time when commerce believed it deserved grandeur, when shopping was treated as a civic experience rather than a private transaction. The influence of these shops extends even into digital spaces. Modern luxury websites replicate the same principles: controlled pacing, curated access, minimal clutter, and emotional storytelling. The medium has changed, but the psychology is identical. What the Gilded Age shops ultimately demonstrate is that luxury is never static. It adapts to social anxiety, economic reality, and cultural desire. It absorbs criticism and reemerges in new forms. Yet, at its core, the equation remains unchanged. Luxury thrives on contrast, on making the ordinary feel distant, on offering entry into a world slightly removed from everyday life. The great shops of the Gilded Age mastered this balance. They turned buildings into narratives. They made consumption feel consequential. They taught society how to desire collectively. Their disappearance was not a failure, but an ending that cleared the way for new interpretations built on the same foundation. To understand modern luxury, one must look backward, to marble floors, stained glass, and softly lit salons where the rules of desire were first written. The most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age may belong to history, but their influence remains woven into how the world continues to buy, admire, and aspire. When viewed in full, the luxurious shops of the Gilded Age functioned almost like secular cathedrals. They inspired awe, demanded reverence, and promised transformation. The act of entering these spaces carried emotional weight. One crossed a threshold from the ordinary into something elevated. This transformation was carefully engineered. Materials were chosen not just for durability, but for symbolism. Marble suggested permanence. Brass and gold implied prosperity. Glass represented modernity and transparency, even when the systems behind the scenes were anything but. Luxury was built into the walls themselves. These environments also trained desire. Customers learned what to want by observing what was displayed, how it was framed, and who else was present. Taste became something to be acquired, not instinctive. To shop correctly was to demonstrate cultural fluency. Over time, this created a feedback loop. The elite defined luxury through consumption, while luxury spaces reinforced elite identity. Shopping did not merely reflect status, it produced it. The social rituals surrounding these shops were equally important. Afternoon visits became routine. Purchases were discussed in drawing rooms. Being seen at the right counter or in the right salon carried meaning beyond the object bought. Retail merged with social life. At the same time, these shops helped standardize luxury. By curating collections and dictating trends, they reduced uncertainty for wealthy consumers. The store became an authority, relieving customers of decision-making while reinforcing dependence on expert taste. This authority extended globally. A gown purchased in Paris or New York carried international legitimacy. Luxury became portable, recognizable across borders. The world's elite learned to speak the same visual language. As these institutions declined, something subtle shifted. Luxury lost its centralized stage. Instead of gathering in one grand space, it dispersed across cities, brands, and experiences. Desire became fragmented, but no less powerful. Still, the Gilded Age shops left behind a blueprint that remains intact. Control the environment, shape perception, slow the customer down, make access feel meaningful. These principles continue to guide luxury today. What changes is the costume. What remains is the structure. The most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age were not simply excessive indulgences, they were systems, carefully designed mechanisms for transforming money into meaning and consumption into identity. Understanding them is not about nostalgia alone. It is about recognizing how deeply modern culture is shaped by ideas born in marble halls more than a century ago. The doors may be closed, but the performance continues. By examining these shops closely, it becomes clear that they did more than reflect wealth. They actively organized it. They channeled new money into visible forms, teaching newly rich families how to behave, what to value, and how to signal legitimacy in a society that still prized old status. For industrialists, financiers, and heirs, shopping in the right places became a way to launder fortune into respectability. A dress from the house of worth, furnishings from an elite department store, or gifts purchased at a prestigious address transformed raw wealth into social acceptance. Retail acted as a gatekeeper. These spaces also blurred the line between public and private life. While technically open to all, they functioned as semi-private arenas where social codes were quietly enforced. Dress, posture, and speech determined how one was treated. Luxury was welcoming, but only on its own terms. The physical scale of these stores reinforced authority. Vast halls dwarfed individuals, subtly reminding visitors that they were entering a world larger than themselves. This imbalance created deference. Customers felt honored to be there, even when spending significant sums. Luxury retail also became a form of urban propaganda. Cities showcased their grand stores as proof of cultural maturity and economic power. A successful department store signaled that a city belonged on the world stage. Civic pride and consumerism became intertwined. During international exhibitions and world's fairs, department stores benefited from increased global attention. Visitors carried impressions home, spreading the reputation of these shops far beyond their physical locations. Luxury became a form of soft power. At the same time, these institutions shaped expectations of permanence. Their materials suggested longevity, even when their business models were fragile. When they disappeared, the shock was cultural as much as economic. Something assumed to be eternal vanished almost overnight. This fragility reveals the central paradox of luxury. It must appear timeless while responding constantly to change. The Gilded Age shops struggled when the pace of change accelerated beyond their ability to adapt. Yet even failure contributed to myth. Closed stores became legends. Demolished buildings gained symbolic weight. The loss itself reinforced the idea that something extraordinary had once existed. Modern luxury thrives on this same dynamic. It promises timelessness while manufacturing novelty. It references heritage while chasing relevance. These tensions were first fully expressed in the retail palaces of the Gilded Age. To study these shops is to see the origins of modern branding, experiential design, and consumer aspiration converging for the first time. They were prototypes, not anomalies. They show that luxury is not just about having more, but about feeling different, separate, elevated. And that feeling, carefully constructed in marble halls and mirrored salons, continues to define how wealth presents itself to the world. As the curtain fell on the Gilded Age, the legacy of its most luxurious shops settled into something deeper than nostalgia. These spaces had permanently altered the relationship between people and possessions. Objects were no longer valued solely for function or craftsmanship, but for what they communicated about the person who owned them. This shift marked a turning point in modern identity. Consumption became a language. Clothing, furnishings, accessories, and even shopping locations spoke on behalf of their owners. The store was no longer a backdrop. It was part of the message. Luxury retailers understood this intuitively. They curated not just products, but lifestyles. Entering these shops meant stepping into a carefully constructed vision of refinement. Customers were invited to imagine themselves as part of a rarefied world, even if only temporarily. The emotional impact of that invitation was powerful. Desire became aspirational rather than practical. The act of purchasing offered reassurance, validation, and a sense of progress. Shopping promised transformation, not materially alone, but socially and psychologically. This emotional framework survives intact today. Modern luxury still trades in feeling as much as fabric or form. Confidence, belonging, and distinction remain the true commodities. The Gilded Age shops were the first to monetize these emotions at scale. Their influence also reshaped storytelling around wealth. Luxury became associated with lineage, heritage, and tradition, even when fortunes were newly made. Retail spaces helped rewrite narratives, allowing new elites to appear established, cultured, and inevitable. At the same time, these shops contributed to a growing divide between image and reality. The elegance on display concealed instability beneath. Many fortunes that funded this retail splendor were volatile, tied to speculation and rapid industrial change. When collapse came, it was swift. This contrast between surface beauty and underlying fragility adds to the enduring fascination with the era. The Gilded Age feels dramatic because it was. Grandeur existed alongside precarity, confidence alongside excess. As historians look back, these shops offer more than visual splendor. They provide insight into how societies cope with sudden wealth, how power seeks validation, and how culture adapts to economic upheaval. The retail palaces of the Gilded Age were stages where these tensions played out daily. Customers performed success. Stores performed stability. Together, they sustained an illusion that felt permanent, until it was not. Yet the illusion was convincing enough to leave a permanent mark. Modern luxury, in all its forms, still relies on the same choreography: controlled access, curated environments, emotional promise. The most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age were not mistakes of excess. They were experiments that succeeded so completely their influence became invisible. And that is their greatest legacy. Not the buildings that remain or the brands that survived, but the way they taught the world how to desire, how to display, and how to believe. In that sense, the Gilded Age never truly ended. It simply learned how to disguise itself. In the final analysis, these shops reveal how deeply luxury is tied to human emotion. They understood that people do not simply want objects. They want reassurance. They want distinction. They want to feel aligned with something larger than themselves. The Gilded Age retailer mastered this before psychology had a name for it. By controlling space, ritual, and access, these stores created emotional certainty in an unstable world. Industrialization had disrupted traditional hierarchies. Luxury retail offered a new structure, one that could be entered, navigated, and understood through consumption. This is why their influence proved so resilient. Even as economies collapsed and cities changed, the emotional logic endured. Desire still seeks staging. Status still seeks visibility. Belonging still seeks symbols. Modern luxury has refined the method, but not the message. The palace became a boutique. The rotunda became a private salon. The grand staircase became a digital scroll. Yet the promise remains unchanged. To step into luxury is still to step into a story carefully written in advance. The most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age were where that story was first told convincingly. And once the world learned to read it, there was no going back. What ultimately defines the most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age is not their disappearance, but how seamlessly their logic embedded itself into modern life. These stores taught society that consumption could carry emotional meaning, social power, and even moral justification. To buy was not indulgent, it was aspirational. They arrived at a moment when traditional markers of status were destabilizing. Aristocratic lineage mattered less in a world reshaped by railroads, factories, and finance. Luxury retail offered a new, visible hierarchy, one that could be learned, entered, and performed. Inside these shops, wealth was translated into order. Chaos remained outside on the street. Within, everything had its place. Goods were arranged, movement was guided. Staff anticipated needs before they were spoken. This sense of control was deeply reassuring in an era of rapid change. Customers were not just spending money, they were participating in a system that affirmed their position in a shifting world. Even uncertainty could be soothed with a purchase that felt correct, sanctioned, and admired. These shops also normalized spectacle. Grand openings, seasonal unveilings, and elaborate displays transformed retail into public events. Crowds gathered not just to buy, but to witness. Consumption became communal, even theatrical. This visibility amplified desire. Seeing others engage reinforced value. The act of shopping became contagious. Luxury relied on audience as much as access. Over time, this dynamic expanded beyond the elite. Middle classes learned to aspire through imitation. Even when luxury remained financially out of reach, its symbols shaped taste and ambition. Desire extended downward, while authority flowed upward. The Gilded Age shops thus helped create a consumer culture that transcended class, even as it reinforced hierarchy. They made wanting universal, while belonging remained selective. Their decline did not end this system. It refined it. Luxury learned to appear less excessive, more intentional. But the emotional contract stayed intact. To this day, luxury promises more than quality. It promises legitimacy. It reassures customers that they are choosing well, living well, and moving in the right direction. That promise was perfected in the marble halls and mirrored salons of the Gilded Age. Those spaces may no longer exist in their original form, but their influence surrounds us. Every curated experience, every flagship store, every carefully staged brand story traces its roots back to these early experiments in desire. The most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age were not relics of a naive past. They were prototypes for a world still unfolding. And in understanding them, we better understand why luxury continues to captivate, long after the chandeliers have gone dark. By stepping back from the spectacle, we can see that the most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age ultimately served as mirrors of their time. They reflected confidence in progress, faith in material success, and a belief that beauty could legitimize power. Retail became a stage where these ideas were rehearsed daily. What made these shops so influential was their ability to make abstract concepts tangible. Wealth became visible. Taste became measurable. Status became something that could be entered, navigated, and displayed. Luxury stopped being hidden behind private doors and moved into the public realm. This visibility reshaped aspiration. People no longer dreamed only of owning land or titles. They dreamed of entering certain spaces, being recognized by certain clerks, carrying packages marked with certain names. Desire attached itself to places as much as objects. The shops also redefined trust. Customers trusted these institutions to tell them what was good, what was current, and what was appropriate. Authority shifted subtly from tradition and class to brands and environments. Retailers became cultural intermediaries. As the Gilded Age faded, These dynamics did not disappear. They dispersed. Luxury fragmented into brands, experiences, and platforms. But the core structure remained intact. Control the setting, curate the message, shape the feeling. Today's luxury economy still depends on lessons learned in those marble halls. Scarcity is engineered, access is managed, atmosphere is designed. Even rebellion and minimalism are carefully staged responses to an older tradition of excess. The most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age remind us that luxury is never just about money. It is about reassurance in times of change, about signaling stability when the world feels uncertain, about turning desire into something orderly and acceptable. Their decline was inevitable. Their influence was not. And as long as people seek meaning through what they buy, the legacy of those gilded palaces will continue to shape how luxury is imagined, presented, and pursued. As we extend this examination, it becomes clear that the most luxurious shops of the Gilded Age were not isolated curiosities, but deeply embedded systems that reshaped everyday life for those who encountered them. They influenced how people dressed, how they spoke, how they judged one another, and how they understood success. Retail was no longer passive. It became instructional. These shops taught customers how to desire correctly. Displays were not random. They were narratives. A mannequin was not simply wearing clothing. It was modeling a future version of the buyer. Window arrangements suggested seasons of life as much as seasons of fashion. Marriage, travel, leisure, and refinement were all implied through objects placed behind glass. The stores also normalized comparison. Shoppers evaluated themselves against others in the same space. Who lingered confidently? Who hesitated? Who was greeted warmly by staff? Luxury retail quietly ranked people in real time. Status was sensed, not announced. This environment reinforced self-surveillance. Customers learned to adjust posture, dress, and behavior to match the setting. The shop demanded performance, and regular visitors became fluent in its expectations. Over time, these behaviors extended beyond the store and into social life itself. For the newly wealthy, this guidance was invaluable. Industrial fortunes arrived faster than cultural acceptance. Luxury shops provided scripts for legitimacy: what to wear, what to buy, how to furnish a home. Retail helped transform money into credibility. At the same time, the grandeur masked vulnerability. Many of these businesses relied on constant growth and unwavering confidence. When economic conditions shifted, the illusion of permanence collapsed quickly. Lavish spaces proved expensive to maintain. Exclusivity proved difficult to scale. Yet, even failure reinforced mythology. Closed stores were remembered more fondly than functional ones. Demolished buildings gained symbolic power. The loss itself became proof of former greatness, cementing their place in cultural memory. This pattern repeats today. Luxury brands trade on nostalgia, heritage, and vanished eras to create depth. Even new brands invent histories to anchor themselves in imagined tradition. The Gilded Age shop taught luxury how to look backward while selling forward. These institutions also reshaped cities permanently. Retail districts became cultural centers. Transportation routes adjusted to accommodate shoppers. Urban life organized itself around consumption. Shopping was no longer incidental to the city. It was central to it. The most enduring legacy, however, lies in psychology. These shops demonstrated that people seek meaning through environments, that beauty persuades, that atmosphere can legitimize inequality by framing it as elegance. These insights continue to guide luxury design, marketing, and branding. Modern consumers may be more skeptical, more informed, and more digitally connected, but the emotional mechanics remain strikingly similar. Desire is still cultivated. Access is still controlled. Identity is still shaped through consumption. The luxurious shops of the Gilded Age were not excesses without consequence. They were formative institutions. They taught society how to shop, how to aspire, and how to equate beauty with value. Their chandeliers may be gone, their counters dismantled, and their names forgotten by many, but their influence remains active. It lives on every time luxury invites us to slow down, step inside, and imagine ourselves transformed. And that, more than marble or glass, is what made these shops truly enduring.